You have just been looking at one of the great art treasures of the late Middle Ages, the choir stalls of the Cathedral of Amiens in France. The Middle Ages, medieval times. Why do we call them that? What were they in the middle of? The term suggests a kind of transitional period, a period that was neither one thing nor another. No suggestion could be more wrong. But the period we call the Middle Ages does stand between two other periods of history that are more closely related to our ways of thinking, our ways of responding to the world.
As modern men, we can understand the world of ancient Rome on the far side of the Middle Ages. The Romans were like modern men in their worldly ambitions, their organization of government, their practicality, their hard-headed values, their commercial and military conquests of the world. On the near side of time, the Middle Ages were followed by the Renaissance. This period, too, we can understand. It was the prelude to modern times when the European world as we know it was being formed.
And so, if by some magic we could drop back into ancient Rome or Renaissance Italy, we might not feel too much out of place. We would share some basic points of view with the people around us. I think we could get to know them and the organization of their world without too much trouble. But I doubt that we could ever feel part of the medieval world. We would have to forget too much that is fundamental to our way of thinking. And we would have to accept too much that as modern men we have forgotten or rejected.
We are the ones whose lives have been shaped by science. And our deep concern with science isolates us from the world of mystical faith, the world of the Middle Ages. The images of the Middle Ages are, of course, Christian ones. Centuries old, they have become familiar to all of us. And this might lead us to think that we understand the world that produced them. But this would be a delusion. These figures were carved some 450 years ago by anonymous artists. And each detail, so skillfully rendered in wood, told a meaningful story to the people of the late Middle Ages. But to most of us living now, today, they are confusing though beautiful records of another age.
What we hope to do then in this film is to try to understand the medieval world through its expression in art. For it is in his art that mankind leaves the purest images of his most profoundly held beliefs, whether worldly or religious beliefs. Particularly, we want to concentrate on the Middle Ages as the world of mystical faith, a faith so all-pervasive that the period is isolated from the world that went before and the world that has come after. We have to say immediately that this will be far from a total picture of the medieval world. We will be documenting mostly the Middle Ages in France.
France was the spiritual as well as the geographical heart of the great proliferation of medieval art and architecture that began about the year 1000 and continued for nearly 500 years. As if the soil of France had suddenly been miraculously fertilized, churches began to arise everywhere. Many of these churches are important in the study of medieval art and architecture. We shall document the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a brief look. Caen, in the mountains of southern France. In Autun, the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare. The Cathedral of Chartres, not far from Paris. The Cathedral of Amiens, on the left bank of the River Somme. and finally, the great Cathedral of Reims in the northeast. By the end of the Middle Ages, which waned during the 14th and 15th centuries, the combination of wealth and faith in France had created hundreds of cathedrals, simpler churches, and castles. In the mountainous region of south-central France is the tiny village of Caen. Isolated from the main streams of modern life, Caen in the Middle Ages was a major point on the high road of holy pilgrimages. Today, Caen is still a pilgrimage spot for the student of medieval art. For here is located one of the great medieval churches and one of the sculptural masterpieces of the early Middle Ages. The Church of Saint-Foy was built in the 11th century. Today, the sculpture above its portal is still in next to perfect condition. Entrance into a medieval church was symbolically entrance into the kingdom of God. Above the main portal, Christ sits in judgment, his right hand raised in blessing, his left lowered against the damned. Below, hell is presided over by Satan, the prince of darkness, the king of evil. Lost souls, the sinners of this world, are goaded by horrible demons into the mouth of hell. Conspicuous among the sinners is a knight in chain mail. He is attacked by demons who pull him from his horse. Within the infernal palace, the damned suffer appropriate tortures. The usurious moneylender is condemned to hang forever with his bag of gold around his neck. The delights of paradise seem pallid after the drama of hell. St. Peter receives the blessed at the doors of a regal palace. Inside, they take their ease. The sculptor's imagination has been less able to conjure up images of bliss than of terror. Death, suffering, damnation were strong in the consciousness of the early Middle Ages. The medieval pilgrimage, made over long distances and difficult terrain, is symbolized at Caen by a band of figures who, much as lesser pilgrims, approached this very church, approached the throne of Christ. Appropriately, these pilgrims are headed by the Virgin, who is followed by St. Peter, identifiable by his key to heaven. A bishop leads a king by the hand. The king is properly humble. The master sculptor of the conch tympanum was a remarkable carver and designer. Every bit of space is used to best advantage. In what might have been a cramped and difficult area to fill, Saint-Foy, the gentle saint to whom this church is dedicated, is received into paradise by the hand of God. Saint-Foy is the patron saint of prisoners, hence the iron chains hanging here, as they do to this day within the church itself. But always, the master of Caen leads us back to the central figure of his composition, Christ, the Judge. A different conception of the same theme, created at about the same time, roughly 900 years ago, gives us some idea of the variety of early medieval sculpture. Over the entrance portals of the Church of Saint-Lazare in Autun, Christ is again represented as the last judge. But the figure is curiously elongated. Unexpected, almost bizarre creatures surround him. The figures have a tense, nervous vitality, an air of fantasy, of hallucination. At Caen, the sculptural power is almost earthy in comparison with the equal but quite different power of Autun. The master of Autun, like other artists of the early Middle Ages, had only a meager tradition of sculpture. For centuries after the fall of Rome, stone carving had been a languishing art in Europe. When the new churches demanded a flood of sculpture, sculptors found two great sources of inspiration. They turned to the world about them, as the master of Caen seems to have done, or to pictorial art, the illuminated manuscripts of the monasteries. Here was a style developed over centuries, and the thin, swirling lines, the deft strokes of the illuminator's brush, are translated into the three-dimensional figures of Autun. Thus a hybrid was produced, part drawing, part modeling. But at both Autun and at Caen, we have masterpieces, but masterpieces in traditions which seem altogether contradictory. Caen, with its somewhat naive but warm style that reaches toward humanity and this world for expression, and Autun, with its nervous and very elegant style, somewhat artificial, reaching toward another world. Not far from Paris lies the cathedral city of Chartres. Here in the 11th century, the two traditions, that of Caen and that of Autun, were integrated by an unknown artist whose work has been called the finest expression in sculpture since the Parthenon carvings of ancient Greece. In the vertical elongations of the figures, the linear quality of the robes, the raised hands, we see the manuscript tradition. But the heads are not mere effigies. No heads in sculpture live more vividly, with more compassionate feeling for the beings that pass beneath them into the cathedral.
We have been referring to early medieval sculpture here. Actually, the term for the early period from about the year 1000 to about the year 1200 is Romanesque. But the term is so inappropriate that it needs explanation. There's not much that is Roman in the so-called Romanesque style. Fragments of Roman statues unearthed in the south of France were used by some medieval sculptors as models for Christian saints. But this echo of the classical past is rare, and the classical spirit is, of course, foreign to the mystical ecstasy of the Middle Ages. As for the term Gothic, a period that we might date from about 1200 to, say, 1500 in France, this term is even more inappropriate than Romanesque. It was coined in the 18th century when a revival of classical taste for things Roman and Greek made the term Gothic derogatory. Well, the connotation of Gothic with the barbarian Goths is completely misleading. And the same terms, Romanesque and Gothic, are applied to medieval architecture, and I'm afraid that here, too, they're not very apt.
Romanesque churches were built with the round arch, a coincidental echo of the Roman arch. Medieval architecture came fully into its own when Gothic architects discovered a way of building that permitted the construction of cathedrals to vast heights. The great height of the Gothic structures was made possible by the pointed arch, or vault, and the flying buttress. The round-headed Romanesque vault was a single curve that moved upward but then turned back towards earth. The apex of the Gothic arch is the climax of two upward movements that seem to point toward heaven. Romanesque columns and walls are somewhat heavy and earthbound. They have to be, for they actually support the weight of the whole structure. But Gothic cathedrals are not supported by their walls, which are little more than skins of stone and glass. And the great vaults, the ribbed ceilings, spring from slender, stalk-like piers. The vaults would collapse were they not supported from the outside by flying buttresses that seem almost to leap up to meet them. Thus, each part of the Gothic cathedral is held in balance, a balance that was at once an engineering marvel and a suggestion for medieval man of the union of man's spirit with God. In sculpture, Gothic art followed the warm, humanizing direction that we saw in the Romanesque heads at Chartres. Most scholars point to the sculpture of the Cathedral of Amiens as the climax of Gothic sculptural idealism. Scenes of torture and damnation still appear, but they seem incidental. Passionate intensity has given way to a calm faith. The overall effect is one of spiritual serenity. But the Middle Ages were too complicated to be expressed within a single style. The dozen individual schools can be identified in France alone. The portals of the Cathedral of Reims are a mixture of many sculptural styles. Some reflect the calm, almost placid quality of Amiens. Others, the more intense, spiritual quality of Chartres. The most individual arise unexpectedly in a type known as the smiling angels of Reims. These delightful figures with their curls, their slanted eyes, their almost sly smiles, are less angelic types than worldly ones, and may reflect the sophistication of courtly life, which in France at this time was already beginning to forecast the end of the age of faith. At the Cathedral of Reims, too, there was, for some unknown reason, a sudden and isolated outcropping of the classical influence. This can be seen not only in the treatment of the drapery in which the figures are clothed, but also in the modeling of the heads, particularly that of the Virgin Mary. The hair, parted in the middle and waving to each side over an oval face, the straight nose, the full, small mouth. These are too consistent with the classical Roman type to be explained as mere coincidence.
We are not certain of the source of the model of the Virgin we have just seen, but a drawing of a fragment of classical sculpture in a medieval sketchbook shows us that at least an occasional work from ancient Greece or Rome was known. This sketchbook was the work of a man named Villard d'Onicourt. Villard, in fact, is one of the few medieval architects or sculptors whose name we even know. Few of them signed their work, and records of their names have mostly disappeared with the centuries. Villard's notebook, however, indicates the kind of man who was involved in the creation of the Gothic cathedrals. Was he an architect or a sculptor? Probably he was both, and good fortune has preserved his sketchbook for us. It is a strong evocation of the kind of man who 700 years ago worked his way from city to city and country to country as the great cathedrals flowered.
Here is a church with a double circumscribing aisle, which Villard d'Arnecourt and Pierre de Corbie contrived together. Behold, two foliaged heads. This is the way for making the most powerful engine known for lifting weights. Here begin the elements of portraiture. How to measure the height of a tower. Take notice that this lion was drawn from life. Behold the martyrdom of Saint Cosmas and Saint Domingue. If you have occasion to carve in wood an excellent poppet for choir stalls, take this design. When I drew this, I was under orders to go to the land of Hungary, and therefore I like the drawing all the better. Many skillful workmen have tried to contrive a wheel that shall turn of itself. Here's a way to make such a one. Here may be seen the figure of pride. This is the elevation of the chapels of the Cathedral of Reims, and all their particulars as they are seen from within.
Even these few comments, with their wide-ranging quality, show us that men of the Middle Ages had inquiring minds. However, science, as we know it, was not yet born. Medieval curiosity about the nature and structure of the world was satisfied not in the scientific laboratory, but by philosophers who organized every facet of the world, all aspects of daily life, all known history, into a philosophical system that related the world to mystical faith. Thus, to the medieval philosopher, all things in the world were symbols of God's will. The most familiar and commonplace things, trees, flowers, animals, became symbols proving the existence of God through the existence of his world. Now let us look, without comment, for a moment, at a painting of the late Middle Ages, Robert Campin's Annunciation. Many of us, I'm sure, are at least familiar with the basic theme of this painting, the appearance of the angel to the Virgin Mary announcing the forthcoming birth of Christ. But how many of the commonplace objects depicted in the painting will we of the 20th century recognize as symbols? Symbols which, to the people of the Middle Ages, were a visible proof of their faith.
The lilies in the jug are the conventional symbol of the purity of the Virgin Mary. The white petals enclose a golden heart, representing Christ in her womb. above the angel's head, the spotless vessel of clear water also symbolizes purity. The 7 rays of light entering through a window represent the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. In one of the side panels, the carpenter, Joseph, Mary's husband, is shown at work, making a mousetrap. This is a complicated symbol, to which the words of the 5th century philosopher St. Augustine give a clue. The cross of the Lord was the devil's mousetrap. The bait by which he was caught was the Lord's death. Thus, the presence of a lowly mousetrap at the scene of the Annunciation becomes a symbol of one of Christianity's major tenets, the redemption of mankind through Christ.
Now, of course, we must be speaking in contradictions when we speak of faith, which is pure belief or trust, and then speak of proving the existence of things that should be accepted on faith alone. This, as a matter of fact, is the great contradiction upon which the philosophical thought of the Middle Ages was based. Faith is mysterious. Proof is logical. How to combine mystery and logic? How to harmonize them? How can mystery and logic coexist? The medieval cathedral is the perfect demonstration that these contradictions were fused in the spirit of the Middle Ages. How was this done, and what did the cathedral mean to medieval man? We will explore these and other questions in the next film, which will be devoted entirely to the greatest of the Gothic cathedrals, the Cathedral of Chartres.
Audine